Hey, what's up, Street Gods? It's Eric from the Eric from Street Photography blog. So, I want to give you guys a practical tip and introduction to Street Portraits 101. So, the first question you got to ask yourself is, what is a street portrait, and I guess why should street portraits? So, for me, the way I would define street portrait is a street portrait is street photography, but it's focused on capturing somebody's gesture. It's focused on capturing someone's likeness. It is focused on capturing someone's soul in a photograph. And generally, I think in street portrait photography, it's more about interacting with your subject and generally with asking for permission, although I don't think it has to, but generally the term street portrait is a little bit loose and it's a little bit not that important. Just the most important thing is I think it's a term that we could use to better explain this concept of finding interesting people we find in the streets and interacting with them. So the question is, why should street portraits? So it's of my opinion that the most valuable thing in photography and street photography isn't to just make good photos or make pretty photos. Rather, I think the purpose of photography and street photography is about living a more engaging life. It's about living more adventurously. It's about interacting with other people. And I think that any type of photography that allows us to be more social is a good type of photography. And so, for example, even myself, I'm a pretty social person. There's a lot of times I feel anxiety about interacting with strangers, or I feel nervous to interact with certain people that I find interesting. And street photography is wonderful because it gives me an excuse to interact with that person. Because if I weren't a photographer and you're just staring at a stranger, it's a little bit weird, it's a little bit creepy. But if you're able to have an excuse to talk and interact with the people, it gives you an opportunity to open up your heart and your world to them. And one of the most difficult things in street photography, and especially shooting street portraits, is how to approach strangers. So, generally, when it comes to approaching strangers, I would recommend trying to figure out ways that you could explain to them why you want to make their photograph. Because I think a lot of people are self-conscious about their image. And if you want to photograph somebody, most people are just like a little bit suspicious. They're like, oh, is he just trying to make fun of me? Is he think there's something weird about me? But I think as a street photographer, whenever you decide that you want to photograph somebody, you're essentially blessing them. You're saying that I find you so interesting and so beautiful or so unique, and there's a reason why I want to make your photograph. So keep in your mind that when you're approaching strangers, often telling people why you find them interesting is actually very beneficial. So, for example, let's say you approach a stranger and they say, oh, excuse me, sir, excuse me, miss, do you mind if I made a portrait of you? And the person says, oh, why do you want to take my photograph? Say, oh, it looks like your face tells a story, or I like your look, or I think you're a good representation of this neighborhood. And when you're telling people why you want to photograph them, be real, be genuine, and essentially don't make things up. And it might even sound weird, like even for me, like I'm a straight heterosexual man. Sometimes I'll approach other men and say, I'll say, oh, excuse me, sir, do I mind if I made a portrait of you? I think you got a great look, or I think you're really handsome. And I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm not trying to hit on you or anything, but that's just the way that I feel. And most people are actually quite open with it. And once people say yes, then there's a step on how to interact with them. And these are some practical tips I would give you. The first tip is get them to laugh. I think in photography and street photography, the photos I love the most are when I'm engaging with people and the photos that essentially put a smile on my face. So in this example of this portrait that I shot in Paris, the first photo I made of this man, he's just looking at me. And then the reason I wanted to make his photo, he had this great teeth. So I essentially just got him to laugh. I'm like, oh, excuse me, can I get one for you? You're laughing. Ha 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 ha. And then by you starting to laugh, it's kind of infectious and the other people start laughing. And then once they start laughing, that's when you take the photograph. The second tip I'll give you is just try to find a simple background. So generally with street portraits, there's two things you could do. First of all, you could approach a stranger that you find interesting in the streets. Say, oh, excuse me, sir, you look pretty badass. Do you mind if I made a portrait of you? He says, yeah, sure. You could look around and say, oh, excuse me, do you mind moving a little bit to the left here or moving over there? This is a simple background. Most people will actually move and you can make their portrait. Or you could just start off by finding a simple background and then just waiting for people to kind of walk by. And then you're like, oh, that guy's interesting. And then you approach them when they're about to walk in front of the simple background. So examples of simple backgrounds like this simple gated background here in the background. So to me, this is a simple background, and yet there's horizontal stripes, which are quite interesting. A simple white background. And also realize that when you're shooting street portraits, it's not rude to photograph people while you're talking with them. And one of the benefits of talking with your subjects while photographing them is they're actually less self-conscious. And the biggest thing to avoid when you're shooting street portraits is someone just looking at the camera, just smiling and doing the peace sign. What you're trying to do is capture a more quote-unquote authentic version of themselves. And most people, they have their guard up when you're photographing them. You essentially want them to drop their guard. So the way you could do that is photograph them by talking to them. And often people do interesting hand gestures and they close their eyes, they're opening their mouths. And the type of questions you want to ask people are open-ended questions. So rather than saying, oh, do you live here? Then they just say yes or no. And then the conversation is dead. I'd rather ask open-ended questions like, oh, what is your dream in life? What is your life story? Or what you been up to today? Or what are some of your passions in life? And the funny thing is, you could actually ask strangers very personal questions, and they're actually quite likely to answer. I've actually found in my personal experience, asking strangers very personal questions, they're more likely to respond than actually close friends and family, because you'll never see them again. And so by asking people open questions like this guy, I said, oh, excuse me, how would you define your own personal style? Then people start to look up, and then that's when you start taking photos, and they do interesting hand gestures as well. Or like even this woman that I saw in New York City, I said, oh, what are you up to today? And she said, oh, I'm 92 years old and I walk myself all the way to church. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And while I'm talking to her, I'm making photos, because you never really know when you're going to make a good photo. So here I shot 36 photos of her, and kind of towards the beginning is when I made the best photo of her. And you could even direct your subjects. And generally a simple thing is, once you've asked for permission, they say, yeah, sure. Then sometimes you're just like, oh, crap. What should the person do? My practical suggestion is just tell your subject, oh, just look up, look down, look left, look right. And in this portrait, I shot this woman. I just asked her to look down, and you can see the cherry on top with a small detail, which makes it nice, is you have like this little Pinocchio nose. And the reason that her nails is able to get so long is I was photographing this during sunset, during golden hour. And this is the edge of a wall, so her nose actually looks longer. And this man here, he looked like the guy from Up. And I just asked him to look up, down, left, right. And then this photo of him looking up looks more triumphant. And if you're curious, I shot this on a digital Ricoh GR version 2. And the technical settings I used, I kept it in P program mode. And on the side, there's this integrated flash. And essentially when I made the photo of him, I just used the flash. And the flash was able to help separate him from the background. And this is another tip too, is if you're photographing your subject when there's harsh light during the middle of the day, so like around like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, use -1 or -2 exposure compensation, sometimes even -3. And what this will do is you could ask your subject to stand in the bright light, and everything in his face is going to be well lit, but everything in the shadows is going to be turned totally pitch black, which makes for a more epic photo. Even this photo, saw this woman with these amazing braids. So, oh, do you mind if you stand in this little stream of light? She said, yeah, sure. And I was able to get this nice detail of her hair in the light. Also, one thing I mentioned earlier is use a flash. The nice thing with using a flash is it adds more intensity to the light, to the photo. It also, practically, if you're shooting at the nighttime, it helps separate them from the background. And you could also create cool effects like this guy smoking a cigarette and you got the flash popping at all these other details from the background. Or even one thing that I've experimented with in the past is you could attach your flash to an off-camera cord or a remote trigger and hold the flash under someone's face. So you got the flash coming from below their chin, and it creates these kind of fun little spooky shadows on top of their head. Another tip is if you want to create a more engaging street portrait, crouch down low and use a wide angle lens. So a wide angle lens being like a 24mm, a 28mm, a 35mm lens. And this creates the Superman effect. It makes the person look larger than life. So this is actually one photo I shot in Chicago. And I actually shot this on a Canon 5D with a 17mm lens. And I got super close and crouched down super long. And he was just dancing. And then because I shot with such a wide angle lens and got close, it makes you feel like the viewers stand like they're standing right next to you, and it really draws you into the scene. And what I like about the composition, all these nice leading lines in the background, which all point towards him. So this is also another good tip is if you're shooting a portrait of somebody on the streets, get very close, crouch down, and look for the leading lines in the background which point to them. Also, if you want to make more engaging, interesting street portraits, try to capture people's hands, the hand gestures. By incorporating more hand gestures into your street portraits, you get more people's soul, you get more engagement, you get more interaction. And so, like, for example, I saw this girl with the braids, and, I asked her to stand in front of a doorway, and here is all shot natural light. This is actually a tip I got from Steve McCurry. And, I took a bunch of photos of her, and none of them were really interesting. I said, oh, do you mind if your braids are beautiful. Do you mind if I just got a photo of your braids? She said, yeah, sure. Click, click, click. And then I made this portrait. And the last tip I'd give you is linger, which means if you find an interesting subject and they've agreed to being photographed, don't just take 1 or 2 photos and run away. Linger, hang out, and just make many photos of them. Chat with them more. And sometimes I've even had conversation with people for 30 minutes, and sometimes none of the photos are any good. But it's really that human interaction that I've been able to get with them, which is so meaningful. So, like, even this was pretty funny. I was in Berlin, and in the middle of the day, found some sort of bar, pub, went inside, and took so many different photos of him. And the longer you linger, the longer you hang out, and the more you shoot, the more likely you are to make a good photograph of them. So don't just feel like you're just going to take 1 or 2 photos and run away. But I would recommend you to, once again, hang out, linger, ask the person open-ended questions, and take a lot of photos. And to wrap up this lecture, don't worry whatever photos you're making is called. As long as the photos give you more optimism in life, as long as your photo making process allows you to interact more with people, to be more adventurous, to have more fun in life, then it's worth it. There's a lot of negative people on the internet who say, oh, street portraits aren't street photography, but who cares about definitions? Make photos that interest you. And also, as a practical tip, whenever you see a stranger that scares you, you must ask for permission to make a photo of them, because it's better to ask for permission to make a portrait of somebody and have them say no and reject you than to not ask at all. And also, another practical tip or assignment you could do it in your street photography to overcome your fear of shooting street portraits is the 10 no challenge. So the simple explanation of the assignment is, on a Saturday or a Sunday, for an entire day, just go around and ask a bunch of strangers to make a portrait of them. And you must keep asking until you get 10 people to say no or reject you. And so the tip is look for the 10 scariest mofos out there and try to get your no's as quickly as possible. You will actually find out that it's harder to get a no than you expect. Okay? So be positive, be smiley, and it will teach you can't always judge people by their outside experiences.